Hello and welcome to Unprofessional Engineering. My name is James.
You got Luke.
Luke, today we're joined by a special guest, Dr. Martin Fisher, co-founder and CEO of KickStart International. Dr. Fisher, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. A pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So, do you go by Dr. Fisher, Martin? What do you prefer?
Yeah, just Martin is great.
Okay, because I think you may be. Is he the first doctor we've had on the show, James?
Boy, I don't know for sure, but I think so.
Of course, it's a fake doctor, right? Because it's only a PhD. It's not an MD.
Not an MD necessarily.
Oh, so if I have a wound, you're not going to be helping me, or a broken.
I don't think so.
Okay. Just checking.
Perfect. So to kick things off here, pun intended there, could you tell us a little bit about KickStart International?
Sure. Well, I mean, our mission is to enable millions of people in Africa to climb out of poverty by making a lot more money. But let me go a little bit back into the history, and I can tell you how I got involved and how it all happened. And first off, I sort of come from a family where you need a PhD in physics just to qualify for the family.
Luke and I do too. You know, we're real disappointments to the family.
So, you know, being a dutiful son, I went to undergraduate at Cornell, then headed off to Stanford, and I did my master's. I was actually a mechanical engineer, not a physicist, but I did my master's, and then I went on and did a PhD in a physics lab, but in mechanical engineering. So I almost qualified for the family, but not quite. And while I was doing my PhD, I got to know some people who were working in international development, and you know, they were trying to say, Martin, maybe you could do something in international development. I'm like, yeah, right, sure, in my next life. But then I went to Peru and spent a summer in Peru trekking in the mountains. I still do a lot of trekking and the like. And that was my first sort of vision and experience with rural poverty and really seeing poverty for the first time. And started thinking, okay, maybe I could do something. Maybe I could take a little bit of time off out of my academic career and go and do something in Peru for a year and look at that issue. And I came back and I applied for a bunch of fellowships, but in particular, a Fulbright fellowship to go to Peru. And they called me, a couple of days before and said, "Sorry, you don't speak Spanish. You're not going to Peru." And
That's fair.
said, "Oh, shoot, well, where could I go?" And I figured, well, in Kenya they speak English, and Kenya was also that's kind of known as a little bit of the center of the proper technology movement at that time. And so I flipped my application over to go to Kenya. Got lucky enough to get a Fulbright, went down to Kenya for 10 months, ended up staying for 17 years and never really looked back.
Just a short extension of the trip. My goodness.
And when I got there, I thought that I could just sort of slot into a program that was working on appropriate technology because, back in the 70s, Schumacher, the economist, wrote this famous book, Small is Beautiful. And there'd been a huge amount of money, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars poured into the appropriate technology movement or the intermediate technology movement. And I sort of thought I would just slot right into that. But when I got there in 1985, a long time ago now, but I got there, I realized that the appropriate technology movement was over by then. Everybody had said, yeah, that was nice, but it didn't work, so we're moving on. And that's how development goes. People get excited about something for 5-10 years, they put a lot of money in, and then it didn't really work, and then they move on to something else. And I was like, well, there's got to be a place for technology somehow in development. And I found a small group at a group called ActionAid. ActionAid is similar to Save the Children. It's a British nonprofit, and they do child sponsorship. And I found a group there that was building low-cost schools. And I joined up with them as a volunteer because even with a PhD in engineering from Stanford, you couldn't get a job in development. And I actually volunteered for 2 years. And I met a guy there called Nick Moon, and he was a carpenter, and he was building these low-cost schools. And I ended up working there for 5 or 6 years and did many things. I built a lot of low-cost schools. I developed a large rural water program where we put in wells and water catchments for communities and pumps. I built a couple of rural workshops where we sort of mass-produced farm equipment, gave away to farmers. I worked with a lot of youth groups, women's groups, got them involved in small businesses. But being a little bit more sort of academic than maybe the average person at the time in development, I sort of looked at this and said, well, are we really having any impact here? What's the sustainability? What's the impact? And realized that all too often we weren't having any impact, and certainly no sustainable impact. And sort of learned a lot of lessons about what works and what doesn't work. One of the things I learned was that thinking about the economics of what you're doing is really critical. Does this thing really make economic sense? Because if it doesn't, it's never going to be sustainable. Working with individuals, not groups, because starting a business as a group is actually very difficult. It's even a bit hard to start a business with two people, but doing it as a big group, it doesn't really make sense. Also realize that you don't want to compete with the private sector. You want to sell things through the private sector. Sell things, don't give them away. And I think the biggest lesson we learned over this was that the poor person's number one need, really anywhere in the world, their number one need by far is really only one thing. And that is a way to make more money. Everybody lives in a cash economy today, just like we do. There's no such thing as a non-cash economy anymore. They need money for everything. They need money for food. They need money for shelter. They need money for school. They need money for clothes. They need money for everything in their life. And if they have a way to make more money, they can get by. If they don't, they never will. And so we said, okay, well, that's clearly the biggest problem. So, and we started telling people at ActionAid that, well, maybe they weren't really solving the biggest problem, and that we had different ways that we thought we could go about doing it. And so Nick and I got fired, and
don't speak out. I see.
Always disappointing at the time, but looking back, obviously the best thing that could have happened. And so we split out on our own and set up a local organization called Aprotech, Appropriate Technology for Enterprise Creation. This is 1991 now, with a mission to enable millions of people to make a lot more money. And what we realized is that, look, everybody is making a small amount of money. They're making enough money to stay alive, because you couldn't live without making some money. They're just not making enough money to get out of poverty. And so we said, well, why is this? Well, there's very few jobs, formal jobs in these economies. In a place like Kenya, something like 6% of the labor force is employed in what we'd really call a formal job, where they pay taxes and have a real job. Another 6% in the government. And if you look at even in India, it's only 10% that are actually employed in the formal private sector. And in other countries in Africa, it's down more like 1 or 2%. Wow. And so the vast majority of people are self-employed. They're employed in the informal sector. And what does that mean? That means either they're on the farm and they're selling whatever they make because they need the money more than they need the food, or they go to the city or the towns or the villages and start doing other self-employment. And the vast majority, about 80% of them, are doing petty trade. They're buying and selling the same things on the side of the road, all competing with each other. And making small margins, but not enough. And then otherwise, they're doing about 1 of 10 different business models. So it's metalwork, carpentry, tailoring, food preparation. There's literally about 10 business models that 99% of the people are doing in the informal sector, all competing with each other, very competitive, low margins. They're surviving, but they're not getting out of poverty. And so we looked at this and said, well, what's the problem? The problem is they're all in the wrong business. That's nice to say, but of course it's hard enough even for you and I to come up with a new business idea, but obviously even more difficult when they have less education, less exposure, coming up with a new business idea. And even if they could come up with a new business idea, they couldn't access the tools and equipment they needed to make that business viable. And of course, throughout history, it's been technology that's powered business, because only with technologies can you make new, lower cost and improved products and services. So throughout history, it's been different kinds of tools and technologies that have enabled businesses to get ahead. But those technologies were simply not available in the local area, and very often not available anywhere. So we said, okay, let's solve these two problems. Let's identify businesses that millions of people could start with a very small investment. They're already starting businesses, they're just starting the wrong ones. And then design the tools and equipment they need for those businesses. And put them on the local market, sell them locally, and have people buy those tools and start these very profitable businesses. And so, that's a nice idea, but what kind of business could a lot of people start? And of course, the first question with any business is, who are your customers? Now, if you're a poor person living in rural Africa or a farmer, who are your customers? Well, who do you know? You don't know many wealthy people. to begin with, there aren't many, and you don't know them anyway. And you certainly don't know any foreigners. So who are your customers? Your customers are other poor people, right? So you better be selling things to other poor people. So what are the poor? What do people buy? The average person buy? Well, they don't have a lot of money to spend, and they don't spend it on many things. But obviously, they pay for food, they pay for shelter, they pay for clothing, farm inputs. They in some places for water, for healthcare, for light, for energy, pay for education, communication, entertainment, transport, hygiene, cosmetics type things. But there's a pretty short list. But you better be selling one of those things, or you don't have a business. Now, the truth is that the poor everywhere in the world, and this is a sad truth, but the poor everywhere in the world pay the highest price per unit for the worst quality goods and services. So, for example, if they're buying cooking oil, they can't afford a bottle of cooking oil, so they're going to be buying cooking oil by the tablespoon and in a little plastic bag. It's the most expensive per unit cooking oil in the world. And if they're buying water, they buy it by the jerry can. It's the most expensive in the world per unit and probably the worst quality also. If they're buying electricity, they're buying a dry cell battery, the most expensive electricity in the world. And even the rent in a place like in the slums in Nairobi per square foot, it's more expensive than in the nice neighborhoods. It's just they only rent 5 or 10 square feet to sleep in. So these should be hard to disrupt, these businesses, because these are businesses where a lot of people are spending a lot of money, high margins, for very poor quality goods and services. So where do we start? We started with, building materials. People want to build a house. What are their choices? They can either use mud and sticks, which is basically free because it's just labor, or they can buy building blocks. Now, building blocks, you could buy concrete blocks, so you could buy fired brick, but these are fairly expensive things. And is there an in-between building technology? So first machine we designed was a machine for manufacturing very low-cost building blocks from soil with just a small amount of cement compressed at very high compaction. So maybe 1 part in 18, 1 part in 20 cement. So very cheap and cured to be very strong. Now with these blocks, they're not quite as good as a concrete block, but they're almost as good and much better than mud and sticks. So we designed that machine. We installed it in the private sector, trained a local company to start and made a little investment in that company. And they've sold tens of thousands of those machines to entrepreneurs who buy that machine. And probably about 1 million houses have been built using that technology across sub-Saharan Africa. Next machine we designed was a machine for making cooking oil from sunflower seed, because if you're a farmer growing sunflower seed and you can't process it yourself, so you sell it to a middleman who takes it to the city, who sells it to the factory, who processes it, who brands it, who packages it, sends it to another middleman who sells it back to you by the tablespoon. There's a huge margin to be made. If you could buy from your neighbors and process it yourself, you could sell the oil to your neighbors at a lower price, give them a higher price for their sunflower, and still make a big margin. So we designed that machine. Again, trained some local workshops to manufacture it and sold. Thousands of those machines were sold. A machine for baling hay. It turns out that if you're a small farmer, you live on a farm, and you want to keep a cow for milk, which is always a good thing to do, you can't let that cow graze. It's going to eat your crops. So you have to keep it in a pen, and that means you have to feed it. Now, in the rainy season, you can grow sort of napier grass between your crops. You can feed it. In the dry season, you have to buy hay, and hay has to be baled in order to be stored and in order to be transported. And the only people with hay balers were very large ranches with huge mechanized balers. The price of hay on the side of the road was $1 or $2. And if you were a small farmer and wanted to grow hay, you couldn't do it. So we designed a human-powered hay baling machine so that you could bale 80 bales a day. And if you look at the math, you're going to make your money back very quickly, even though the machine was about, I think it was about $1,800, but you make your money back in 2 or 3 weeks. So these were very profitable businesses, and we've sold hundreds of those also through, again, installed in the local private sector.
Did you say that you would make your money back in 2 or 3 weeks on that investment?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Because you're making $80 to $160 a day on a $1,600 investment. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, the old adage, like your business model was literally, instead of giving them fish, you're going to teach people to fish. I mean, bare bones, you were providing the means for people to make their own businesses, rather than, like when you typically think of, philanthropy, you're giving someone a thing and they take it and then they consume it and then it's gone and then it needs to be given to them again and given to them again. It sounds like you're your approach was, that's okay, but the better thing is let's give them technology, let's give them training so that, that food or that income or those crops or whatever it might be, they can produce that themselves once they've gone through the training, once they've purchased this, relatively inexpensive piece of equipment in the grand scheme of things. Is that pretty much
exactly
the business model?
That's right. So basically we're saying we're going to sell them a better fishing rod, right?
Yeah.
And so that they can then catch fish and they can have a business, catching and selling fish. And so we're talking about money-making devices, which they can buy and start a business. It's kind of a business in a device that we now say, they can buy that device and set up a business with it. And so with these ones that we developed, with the block press, with the oil press, with the hay baler, so tens of thousands of businesses have been created across Africa. But we said, that's nice, but we need to create millions of businesses. What business could millions of poor people in Africa start? And so, 80% of the poor in sub-Saharan Africa are smallholder farmers. They live on a small plot of land. They sort of scrape out an existence with hand tools, and they plant at the same time. They harvest at the same time. They sell into a crowded market and get very low prices and then fall into poverty in the dry season. What business could they start? And it turns out by far the best business for them to start is to move from rain-fed farming, where they do that as I just described, to irrigated farming. Because with irrigation, you can now plant throughout the year. You can literally harvest every day. You can grow high-value crops, and especially you can bring them out in that off-season, in the long dry season when there's no other crops on the market. They call it the hungry season in Africa, in fact, because that's when people go hungry. And the prices, of course, are high, and the demand is high. And with the rain-fed farming, it's even worse. Something like 40% of the crop rots in the field because the market is flooded at that time when everybody harvests, and they can't even sell it. So it's a huge, huge benefit to be able to switch to irrigated farming. But it turns out there's virtually no irrigated farming in sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, 20% of farmland is irrigated, produces 40% of our food and 60% of the value of that food. Across Asia, over 40% of farmland is irrigated. In India, over 50% is irrigated already. Sub-Saharan Africa, 4% of farmland is irrigated, only 4%. Wow. And most of that's in Madagascar and South Africa and Sudan. So most countries, it's more like 2 or 3% of farmland. Like I said, compared to that 40% in Asia or over 50% in India. And so it's absolutely huge opportunity. It just means there really is no food in those off seasons. And if you can produce food in those off seasons, you can make a lot of money. And so there's also no history of irrigation. And what that means is, people have been doing this rain-fed farming for generations. And now to think about switching to irrigation that's a major, major shift in their life. They have to get up every day and irrigate and cultivate instead of sort of waiting for the rain and then waiting for the harvest. But also there were no technologies for irrigation. You could buy petrol pumps back then, but they were very expensive coming in from China or India. And of course, expensive to buy, expensive to maintain, and then you need to buy petrol every day, transport that to your poor rural home, store it. And every day you're paying dollars in petrol to run your pump. So this is why we developed a line of human-powered, manually operated irrigation pumps. And of course, it's a challenge because a human doesn't put out all that much power. If we go into the gym these days, if we're very fit, maybe we can produce on a bicycle or a treadmill, 200,
not us,
300 watts maybe for a few minutes. The best athletes can do 450 for a few minutes, but but the average person just walking, putting out about 100 watts. That's enough for one light bulb. And so we don't have a lot of power, but can you turn that power into an extremely efficient water pump? And the other thing about irrigation is people need to have a shallow well. Now, it turns out there's a huge amount of shallow groundwater across sub-Saharan Africa. They're using less than 5% of their renewable groundwater. And then there's a lot of surface water as well. And for many, many people, probably 20, 30% of farmers, they can literally dig a hole on their farm, and within 2, 3, 4 meters, they get to water. So all you have to be able to do is pull that water up and push it out onto your field. But you're not going to dig that hole right by your house. So the pump has to be portable. You can't leave it in the field. It'll get stolen. So you need a portable pump. They don't have any tools. You need a pump which you can install and use without any tools, maintain without any tools. Has to be extremely durable. It's miles off the road. You don't want it breaking down. And so there's a lot of stringent design criteria to make something that's really tough enough. But this is where we started. And we started off with a little Stairmaster machine, like a little take-home Stairmaster machine that you walk back and forth. And it pulls water out of, it has two pistons, and it pulls water out of a shallow well as deep as 7 meters, a little over, or 8 meters deep, and then pushes it out through a hose pipe under pressure. You can push it vertically another 7 or 8 meters or hundreds of meters along flat ground. So you can irrigate up to sort of 2 acres with it. And it's like a garden hose. You can spray it. So we designed that pump. We call it, well, we started back then, it was called the Super Moneymaker. Our brand is money making because people's number one need is a way to make money, right? So money.
You guys know your market, right?
So that was a Super Moneymaker. Today it's the Moneymaker Max is our latest version. And that's nice. That was retailing about $160 with the hose pipes in Africa. And you want that to be a full plug and play package where somebody takes it home. All they do is they stick on the hose pipes and they can start pumping. And of course, the retail price, that includes a markup for the distributor and the retailer and manufacturer, of course.
Could I interrupt you real quick? Speaking of the prices, so you said it was around what, $160 per unit?
Yeah, that one's about $160. Yeah.
How do these farmers who are already struggling to make money come up with this? Now, I know to some of us listening, it might not sound like a whole lot of money. $160, they'll be able to cover that. But if you're already not making any money, how do you cover these costs?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Of course, one of our criteria with all the technologies we've ever designed is that you can recover your money within what we call farm time. And because people are used to putting their money in the ground to plant until harvest. And that's usually about 6 to 9 months. So our design is always that they can make their money back, 100% of their money back within that period. And on irrigation, in fact, you can make much, much more than that. In the first year, on average, these farmers are making about $700 profit with this pump. So it's extremely quick payback. And in fact, you make it back on the first harvest, which is maybe 3 or 4 months out. But still, you've got to get the capital. Now, farmers do different things. If they're buying on their own, they would sell their maize crop or their staple food crop because they get a little bit of money at that time and invest in this pump. They would maybe sell a goat or an animal. But it is a challenge. And that's why we said, okay, the problem with our pump is it's too expensive. Can we design a cheaper pump? So the next pump we tried to design was really a hand pump, which looks like a bicycle pump. And you're pulling up and down with your arms. And you can try that for about 30 seconds and your arms start getting... And so we did that. We launched this hand pump and it was very cheap and everybody loved it except until they started using it for a few minutes. And then they're like, oh my God. So we kind of pulled that off the market. It was selling like hotcakes, but we realized people weren't actually using it. And certainly not making any money with it. They were abandoning it pretty quickly. And then I was back here in California years later, and you're sort of playing with that pump and put it into the corner of the wall, between the wall and the floor, and was sort of leaning on it and thinking, wow, this is a much easier operation. You're leaning in and out instead of using your arms. And so we just modified the hand pump and put it on a base with a pivot. And we call it our hip pump because it's actually a hip motion. Oh. You can do it with straight arms, and you're basically dancing back and forth. And you don't actually use your arms to pull up and down anymore. You're using your whole body. You're leaning. Much, much easier to operate, just changing the ergonomics. And so that hip pump, we started producing that, and that is about $90 with hose pipes. It's still a lot, and eventually we get into a very cheap pump. We're launching this year even cheaper. Yeah, so what happened is we said, okay, we can make these things, and we started by making them in Kenya with local workshops, starting with training individual little workshops to make them. But then you realize, well, with economies of scale, that doesn't make sense. So we upsized to bigger workshops. And it was very challenging because mass production wasn't happening back then in Kenya. And even today, it's very, very little mass production. The quality of the raw materials you were getting were very, very random. So we'd buy, for example, a 2-inch by 1-inch by 3 millimeter, or in millimeters, 50 by 25 by 3 millimeter rectangular hollow section. And if you buy that at a good manufacturer, it's always 50 by 25 by 3. If you buy that from a manufacturer that we were chasing in Kenya, we'd find sometimes it was usually undersized, maybe 48, maybe 47, maybe 22, but always different. And so you try to do high quality mass production with randomly sized material, and it's a big challenge. So we had to develop a whole new methodology of jigs and fixtures, and in order to do quality mass production with poor quality materials, we did all that. And we were training factories. We had some of the biggest factories in Kenya and one in Tanzania also manufacturing these pumps. And that was great when we were hitting the Kenya and the Tanzania market. But as we started to expand later into other markets outside of East Africa, we realized the cost of transportation was way too high. So for example, taking something from Kenya to Mozambique, virtually impossible. There's no ships, there's no roads. It was much, much cheaper to mass produce in China and ship from China to Mozambique than it was from Kenya to Mozambique. And we could get even cheaper and better quality production happening in China. So we did move all manufacturing to China. And that did help us to stabilize and bring down the costs, and definitely made supply chains much cheaper in the long term, which is sad, but the truth. And we always believe in local selling through local retail shops, because the most sustainable thing in Africa is their very dynamic local businesses. And so we sell through those shops, and those shops, of course, have to make a markup. And then the question is, how do you convince farmers to irrigate? And this is why we're a nonprofit, because convincing farmers to change from not irrigating to irrigating is a major, major behavior change. They have to get up every day, irrigate, cultivate. They're selling different crops. They're selling into different markets. And changing behavior is a slow process, especially when you're now reaching the poorest, most risk-averse, hardest to reach customers in the world. You know, they're miles off the tarmac road. You have to get to them, and you have to convince them now to invest in a brand new product they've never seen and completely change their lives in terms of, you know, generations of farming practice. And so that takes a lot of effort, a lot of getting to know them, a lot of building trust and convincing them. And so we had a team of staff who are literally running around farm to farm demonstrating. Of course, we also used billboards and radio and things like that to create awareness, but people had to see it to believe it. So you actually had to get out there and demonstrate. And this was expensive. We did convince people to do it and then go down to the local shop and buy. And that happened. We did it in Kenya. Then we went down to Tanzania. And then people said, yeah, but East Africa's easy. So we went off to Mali and West Africa. We did it in Mali. We did it in Burkina. And then we went down to Zambia and Southern Africa. And to prove that we could do this, and because we're using donor funds in order to do all that marketing and all that behavior change effort, because you really need to do that. You can no way you can do that profitably, because it's a very, very big cost just to go visit a farmer, you know, miles off the road. We, of course, measure the impacts. So we measure the impacts very carefully. And we visit farmers right when they buy a pump. And then we come back and visit them 18 months later, and then 36 months later. Now, not every farmer, but a randomly selected number of farmers, of course.
Okay.
And we started selling pumps really in 2000. And by 2015, 2016, we could honestly say that 1 million people had used our pumps to take a major step to climb out of poverty. But it had taken us 16 years, and it had been expensive. And the donors were putting in that money, and it still was a good bang for the donor's buck, because someone's literally out of poverty for their life. Because now they can afford to send their kids to school, they can build a better house, they can make other investments. But still, it was taking too long, and it was too expensive. So at that point, we took a look and said, well, you know, how could we be much more efficient at this? How can we do this more cheaply? But at the same time, we started asking ourselves, what would it take to move Africa from 4% irrigated to 20% irrigated? Because at 20% irrigated, we think if 1 in every 5 farmers is irrigating, we know that they can feed about 10 families from their farm. And so they could feed the other 4 or 5 families in the rural area, plus the other 4 or 5 that have gone to the urban areas. So if we can get to 1 out of 5 farmers irrigated, we believe we have a chance of Africa growing enough food to feed itself. What would it take? Now that's about 20 million farmers, about 100 million smallholder farms in sub-Saharan Africa. So what would that take? And we said it would really take 3 things. First of all, yes, absolutely, we have to prove that it's possible. So we can move from 1 million to 2 million. Can we do it in half the time instead of taking 16 years? Can we get 2nd million in 8 years? Yes, we can do that. We're going to change our model. I'll tell you that in a minute. Secondly, we need the right set of technologies. We have these human-powered pumps. We have, the $160 pump. We have the $90 pump. And of course, we've been modifying these and improving them all the time, making them more hydrodynamic, efficient, and more ergonomically efficient. But we need more than that. We need other ways of accessing the water, drilling wells, catching water. We need lower cost pumps, something closer to the $50 range or even cheaper. We need solar pumps now that solar prices have come down. We need better ways of financing pumps. So we need a set of innovations in order to make it possible to get to that 20%. On top of that, we need to change the conversation around irrigation. We've been going to these conferences for years, agricultural conferences. There's never been any discussion of smallholder irrigation around what would be really good for smallholders in sub-Saharan Africa. It just hasn't been part of the conversation. We need to get to the point where we can catalyze a movement to irrigate Africa so that the major stakeholders, the donors, the philanthropists, the major bilateral, multilateral donors, the UN, the World Bank, start to fund African governments to put in place the right policies, the right subsidies, the right investments, the private sector also, to really kick off irrigation on a large scale. So we put together a new strategic plan in 2015, 2016 with really those three pillars. One is the right set of innovations. Two is getting another million people out of poverty in half the time. And three is this advocacy play. And to get another million people out of poverty in half the time, we said we have to completely pivot our model. Instead of going door to door, convincing farmers and building that relationship with farmers, what we need to do is we need to work through partners who are already out there, who already have a trusted relationship with thousands of farmers. So these are the big international NGOs, the local NGOs, the government agencies, the UN agencies, who are already working in sub-Saharan Africa with farmers. They might be working on water or health or other things, but if they could introduce irrigation into their programs, we know that their farmers could now achieve whatever it is that they wanted them to do. If they want to do education, well, their farmers are making money. They can send their kids to school, secondary school. They have money now. If they're talking about health and nutrition, well, farmers who irrigate have better health and nutrition. And if they're talking about whatever it is, their mission is, we know that if their farmers could irrigate, they could get closer to hitting their mission. In fact, there's something like 12 of the Sustainable Development Goals that farmers who irrigate help Africa to reach. And so we pivoted our model, said, let's work with these partners, convince them to introduce irrigation. They already have a trusted relationship with their farmers. We don't have to get to know that. We're going to leverage that. We still put in place a private sector supply chain so the pumps and the spares are locally available. We expand to 16 countries instead of the 4 or 5 we were in. And that's the pivot we've made since 2016. And it's much, much more cost effective, much more efficient in terms of getting a lot of pumps out there.
So before we go on about the pivot and how things have gone since then, we're going to have to take a break right now for this episode, but join us again for the second part of this series where we discuss more about how KickStart International is bringing people out of poverty in Africa and seeing how they use technology to do so. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been super interesting, and I'm looking forward to the second half.
Fantastic. Thank you. Me too.